What if everything you thought you knew about the universe was a lie, and the truth has been silently unfolding around you all along? As the line between reality and the unknown begins to blur, one man must face the terrifying revelation that humanity's future has already been written and it's not in our hands. The night was still, the kind of calm that settles in after the day's distractions have faded into the quiet hum of suburbia. He sat by the window, sipping his drink, the soft glow of the television screen lighting up the room. Life had been routine for him, simple, predictable. A man content with the ordinary. But that night, something would pierce through his tranquility, something so foreign that he wouldn't recognize the world around him by the time morning came. It started with a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible hum, like the faint vibration of distant machinery, was barely enough to stir his attention at first. But it didn't stop. The sound grew louder, its frequency rattling his nerves. It was no longer the hum of a passing car or the air conditioner kicking on. This was different, unfamiliar. A static, rhythmic noise that felt wrong. He stood up, drawn to the window. Outside, the world was unchanged, an ordinary night, the moon casting its silver glow across the neighborhood, the streetlights flickering gently in the cool air. Nothing out of the ordinary, but the sound persisted, growing steadily louder. He opened the window, letting the cool breeze rush in. The noise was undeniable now, its source just out of reach, like a sound that belonged to another world. His heart began to race, a low, heavy thrum that seemed to vibrate in his chest, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't a car. It felt otherworldly. Something inside him stirred, an instinct that told him to look, to search for the cause, even if he didn't fully understand why. His eyes scanned the night sky, but nothing appeared. Nothing except the stars, thousands of them, scattered across the velvet expanse. His mind struggled to place the sound, to make sense of it. Was it coming from the ground? Was something underground? But then, it hit him, a flicker of light on the horizon, small but distinct, pulsing rhythmically in the darkness. The light blinked again, this time larger, brighter. The hum seemed to synchronize with the pulsing light, as if they were one, something so perfectly in tune that it felt wrong. He couldn't look away. His instincts told him to step back, close the window, go inside, forget it all. But he didn't. Instead, he took a step forward, pulled by some unseen force, drawn to the mystery that hovered just beyond the edge of his understanding. The night had gone from mundane to unsettling, and he could feel the change deep in his gut. Something was watching him, waiting, and he wasn't sure if it was already too late to turn back. The light hovered just beyond the tree line, its glow unmistakable against the dark night. It wasn't the soft flicker of a distant streetlight or the warm glow of a campfire. This was something different, something that pulsed with an eerie, unnatural rhythm, like it was alive. For a moment, he thought it was an illusion, a trick of his mind playing on him. But then it flickered again, casting an otherworldly hue across the field, and his breath caught in his throat. The hum from earlier had turned into a strange vibration in the air, as though the entire atmosphere was being affected by the presence of this light. His legs felt stiff, his movements hesitant as he slowly stepped away from the window, his curiosity propelling him forward. The light was no longer distant. It was close now, much closer than before. As he walked toward the backyard, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger now, more oppressive. The air around him seemed to crackle, charged with an energy that felt both unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. He pushed open the back gate, stepping into the quiet of the yard. The light was just a few paces away, now brighter, illuminating the long grass that swayed gently in the night breeze. His heart raced, but he couldn't pull himself away. He was drawn to it, compelled to get closer, to understand what it was. Each step felt like an eternity, as the light pulsed in the distance, growing larger, more defined. But then, as he neared the center of the field, the light flickered once more. Faster this time, before it vanished entirely. One moment, it was there, an undeniable presence. The next, it was gone. The air, once electric with tension, went deathly still. For a moment, he stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the light had been, trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed. Had it been a trick of his eyes? He stepped forward, scanning the empty sky, hoping for a sign, for something to tell him that what he had seen was real. But there was nothing. No sign of the glowing object, no flicker in the sky. Just the empty stretch of land, bathed in the faint light of the moon. A chill ran down his spine, and for the first time that night, he felt the weight of something dark and unknown pressing down on him. He turned, ready to retreat to the safety of his home, but the unease lingered, like a shadow he couldn't shake. The world felt different now, as if the fabric of reality had shifted, if only for a moment. Something had changed, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face what was coming next. The next night, the feeling returned. It wasn't just the lingering unease of a strange encounter, this was something far more pervasive. It was like an invisible presence, following him, tracking his every movement. He tried to shake it off, blaming it on the strange events of the night before, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. The moment he stepped outside to take the trash to the curb, his skin prickled. The air felt thick, charged with an unseen energy that made him uncomfortable. His gaze darted around the yard, but there was nothing unusual, no lights, no sounds, just the soft rustling of leaves in the trees. Yet, the sensation didn't go away. It only grew stronger as he walked to the end of the driveway. He paused, his breath catching in his throat, sensing something moving just outside his line of sight. A shadow, a flicker of movement between the trees. He whipped around, but the moment he did, it was gone. Yet, as he stood there, staring into the dark expanse of his yard, a chill crept up his spine, one that had nothing to do with the cool air. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. The sensation of being watched followed him inside. Even as he sat in the living room, his eyes kept darting to the windows, searching for something he couldn't quite define. Shadows outside seemed to linger too long, stretching unnaturally against the walls. He glanced at the clock. It was late. Maybe it was just exhaustion, the weight of the past few nights catching up with him. But something in his gut told him it wasn't. As he went to bed, he pulled the covers tight around his body, trying to block out the growing sense of dread. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every groan of the floorboards felt amplified in the silence. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. And then, just when he thought he could finally drift off, he heard it. A whisper, low and barely audible, coming from the darkness just beyond the edge of his room. His eyes snapped open. The whispering stopped, replaced by a stillness that was almost worse. He held his breath, straining to hear. Nothing. But the unease remained, gnawing at him like a persistent itch. There was someone, or something, just outside his reach, watching, waiting. The clock ticked loudly in the quiet room, but it was as though everything else had faded away, leaving only the sense of being trapped in a moment that stretched on forever. He wasn't sure how long he lay there, staring at the ceiling, willing himself to believe it was nothing. But in the pit of his stomach, he knew he wasn't alone. And whatever it wasn't going anywhere. Over the next few days, the unsettling feeling of being followed grew unbearable. It started with small things, flickers of movement at the edge of his vision, figures that would vanish the moment he turned to look. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But then it became harder to ignore. He'd be walking down the street, or in the kitchen, and there, just beyond the doorway or across the yard, he'd catch the shape of someone or something moving too quickly to make out. He began to feel eyes on him at all times. It wasn't a casual glance, like someone watching you from across a room. No, it felt like something far darker, a deep, penetrating gaze that seemed to follow his every step. Every time he glanced toward the source, there would be nothing there, but the sensation never disappeared. It clung to him like a shadow. One evening, as he sat in his living room, the feeling hit again, stronger than ever. He looked toward the hallway, instinctively drawn to the corner where the dim light from the kitchen spilled into the darkness. He saw it just for a fraction of a second, the figure, standing motionless in the corner. It was tall, dark, and shifted unnaturally fast when he tried to focus on it. His heart pounded in his chest, but as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, slipping out of sight like a ghost. He stood up, his legs trembling, and moved toward the hallway. The house was eerily silent, but the cold dread remained. He forced himself to step into the dark, half expecting the figure to reappear. He turned the corner, his breath shallow, but there was nothing, just the shadows dancing on the walls, as normal as ever. Still, the hair on the back of his neck stood on end, the tension thick in the air. Every time he thought he had convinced himself it was just his mind, the figures would return. The second he relaxed, they'd slip back into the corner of his eye, too quick to catch, always leaving him with the unmistakable sense that he was being watched. The following night, as he tried to sleep, his anxiety was unbearable. His eyes darted around the room, scanning for any sign of movement. He could feel them, those figures lurking just out of sight, waiting for him to slip into unconsciousness. The stillness in his bedroom was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling. It was then that he heard its footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving from the hallway into his room. His breath caught, and for a moment he lay completely still, praying that it was his imagination. But the steps grew closer, and the hairs on his arms stood up. He had to look, he had to know. But when he finally dared to glance over, the room was empty save for the suffocating silence and the undeniable feeling that whatever had been following him was closer than ever. It was a night like any other, yet there was something different in the air, an unnatural stillness that clung to the world. The usual sounds of the night, crickets chirping, the rustling of leaves had faded, leaving only silence. His restless mind had been consumed by thoughts of the shadows, the figures, and the chilling sense that something was closing in on him. He had spent the evening pacing the house, every creak and groan of the old building making his heart race. And then, it happened. A light. Not the usual street lamp glow or the soft flicker of a distant star. This was something else entirely, a soft, pulsing light that seemed to hover just beyond the tree line. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate the surroundings, but it had a certain vibrancy to it, like it was alive. He stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the source. His mind screamed at him to stay inside, to ignore the pull of curiosity. But his feet moved before he could stop them. He stepped outside into the chill night air, drawn by the light as if it were calling to him. Each step felt heavy, as if the earth beneath him was pulling him closer to whatever waited in the shadows. The light grew brighter as he moved, but it didn't seem to come from any recognizable source. It didn't flicker, as most lights did. It simply pulsed. Steady and hypnotic. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, but he couldn't stop himself. He felt as if his body had become a mere passenger, and the light was guiding him towards some inevitable confrontation. As he reached the edge of the yard, the light suddenly flickered in intensity, blindingly bright for just a moment, and then settled back into its strange, steady pulse. That's when he saw it hovering silently above the ground, a shape he couldn't quite comprehend. It was unlike any aircraft he had ever seen, its edges too smooth, too perfect. The object seemed to shimmer, as if made from a material that didn't belong on Earth. There were no sounds, no engines, nothing to indicate its presence other than the unsettling pull of its light. Fear gripped him, but still, he couldn't move. He stood there, transfixed, unsure whether to run or reach out, to escape or discover what it wanted. His breath hitched in his chest, the cold air making it hard to breathe. The UFO hovered above the ground, unmoving, as if studying him. It was then that he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched, not by eyes, but by something far more intelligent, something that knew him. Time seemed to stretch, the seconds pulling out into eternity, and just as quickly as it had appeared, the object began to retreat, its light dimming as it ascended into the night sky. His legs finally gave way, his knees buckling beneath him as the last traces of the light disappeared. The world returned to silence, but the cold terror remained, clinging to him as if the encounter had left its mark forever. The night air was still, too still, as he stood in his yard, trying to process what he had just witnessed. His body trembled, and his heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like a warning. The UFO had vanished, but the remnants of its eerie presence lingered, like a shadow on the edge of his consciousness. He told himself it was over, that he was safe, but deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The silence that followed was suffocating, but it didn't last long. Without warning, a beam of light shot down from the sky, cutting through the darkness like a knife. It was bright, too bright, and it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. His breath caught in his throat as the beam struck the ground just in front of him. He instinctively took a step back, but the light moved with him, as if it had a mind of its own. Then, without warning, he felt it, a force, a pull, like invisible hands grabbing at his body. His feet left the ground, and his body was lifted upward, as if weightless. Panic surged through him, and he tried to scream, but his voice was trapped inside his throat. He reached out for something, anything, to hold on to, but the air felt thick, like it was resisting him. He flailed against the force, trying to break free, but it was no use. His body was being pulled upward with an unnatural strength, and the harder he fought, the stronger the force became. His legs kicked out, his arms flailing in the air, but there was nothing solid to grab. The beam wasn't just light, it was something more, something that had the power to bend the laws of physics. He gasped for air, but his chest felt constricted, as if the air itself was being pulled from him. The beam wrapped around him, tightening like a rope, and he could feel his body being drawn toward the source. He wanted to fight, to scream, to escape, but the force was too strong. He felt helpless, like a puppet on a string. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pull stopped. The beam of light vanished without a trace, leaving him suspended in midair for a brief moment. His heart raced, and he could feel the cold sweat trickling down his spine. He fell to the ground with a thud, the air rushing out of his lungs as he hit the earth. Gasping for breath, he lay there, trembling, his body aching from the strange force that had taken hold of him. His mind raced to make sense of what had just happened, but it was impossible. He had been so close, too close. Something had tried to take him, and for the first time, he understood that the encounter was far from over. Something was out there, watching, waiting. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the room, but it did little to ease the unease gnawing at him. His sleep had been restless, filled with fragmented dreams of endless darkness and strange, inescapable pulls. He sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes, trying to shake off the lingering effects of the night's terror. His thoughts were a blur, a disjointed mess of fear and confusion, and yet, something about the whole experience felt off, as if a part of him was missing, like there was something he should remember, but couldn't. It wasn't until he looked at his arm that the true horror of the previous night hit him. A strange, glowing mark marred the skin of his left forearm, a symbol he had never seen before. It was faint, yet unmistakable. The edges shimmered with an ethereal light, pulsing rhythmically, as if it were alive. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a trick his mind was playing on him after such a harrowing experience. But when he touched it, his fingers recoiled. The mark was cold, like the surface of something ancient, and it sent a sharp jolt through his body. His heart raced again, the same panic flooding his veins that he had felt when the beam of light had pulled him upward the night before. He traced the mark with his fingers, trying to make sense of it, but it only seemed to grow more pronounced the more he touched it. The sensation was overwhelming, like a deep, gnawing feeling of dread that settled in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't understand it. He had no recollection of how it got there or what it meant. Memories of the attempted abduction flooded back, but they were fleeting, like wisps of smoke he couldn't quite catch. He remembered the pull, the terrifying beam of light, and then nothing. It was as if his mind had been blocked, like something had deliberately erased the details. A shiver ran down his spine as the realization struck him. He had been altered. The mark wasn't just a reminder of what had happened. It was a sign, a symbol of something far more sinister. He felt it deep in his bones. The visitor had left its mark on him, a physical manifestation of the strange force that had tried to take him. But why? What did it mean? And why couldn't he remember everything? As he stood up and moved toward the mirror, the weight of the situation settled over him. The mark on his arm seemed to pulse with each beat of his heart. And for the first time since the encounter, he felt a bone-deep certainty. This wasn't over. Whatever had been left behind was only the beginning. In the days that followed, something shifted within him. At first, it was subtle, a creeping sense of unease that lingered just beneath the surface, gnawing at his peace of mind. But it wasn't until the dream started that the true weight of the experience settled in. Each night, without fail, he would drift into a restless sleep, only to be pulled into a darkness so thick it felt like he was sinking, drowning in the void. There, in the center of it all, was the figure. It was always the same, standing at the edge of his consciousness, just out of reach but never out of sight. Tall, shapeless, and shadowed, it stood as if it were part of the darkness itself. Its presence was overpowering, suffocating. He could never see its face, but he could feel its eyes on him, cold, unblinking, and knowing. The figure never spoke, not once. It didn't need to. Its intentions were clear as the cold, empty air between them. It was watching him, waiting. He could sense its silence. A deep, unsettling stillness that filled the space, pressing in on him from every side. It was as though the very act of looking at him, of existing in his dreams, was enough to make him feel small, insignificant, powerless. He would wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The room was always too quiet, too still. His eyes would scan the darkness, half expecting the figure to be standing there, just out of view. But it never was. Yet the fear lingered, like a shadow that clung to his thoughts long after the dreams faded. During the day, the figure never left him. Its presence remained, as though it had seeped into his waking life. It was in the way his mind wandered, drifting to thoughts of the strange mark on his arm, of the beam of light that had nearly pulled him away. It was in the corners of rooms, the feeling that someone or something was there, even though no one was. He would glance over his shoulder, only to find empty space staring back at him. As the days turned into weeks, the dreams grew more vivid, more intense. The figure's proximity felt closer with each passing night. It would step forward, slowly, silently, and just when he thought it might reach out to him, he would wake again, his pulse racing, his breath shallow. He was becoming more and more consumed by the figure. It wasn't just in his dreams anymore, it was in his waking hours too. The air felt thicker around him, the walls seemed to close in tighter. The figure was still there, watching, waiting, and he knew, deep down, that it wouldn't be long before it made its move. His days had become a blur, each one blending into the next. The figure haunted him, lingering in his thoughts like a heavy fog that never quite lifted. Every night, the dreams grew more vivid, more relentless, and every morning, he woke with a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't shake the sense that something far greater than just a strange encounter was at play. He needed answers, the logical part of his mind, the one that had always relied on facts and reason, now found itself drowning in fear. And so, in a desperate attempt to gain some control, he began his search. He started small, typing UFO abductions into the search bar with shaking hands. The results flooded his screen, a mass of articles, testimonies, and strange theories. He clicked through the pages, each one more unsettling than the last. Stories of people who had been taken, marked, and left with memories too fragmented to piece together. The chilling parallels to his own experiences were undeniable. There were accounts of people waking with unexplained markings on their bodies, of strange lights in the sky, of an overwhelming sense of being watched. But there was something even darker about the information he was uncovering. This wasn't just some rare event. It wasn't just a few isolated cases. The more he read, the more it became clear. What he was experiencing was part of a much larger pattern, one that spanned across decades and continents. One name stood out among the others, a name he couldn't shake from his mind: the Greys. The online forums were filled with speculation about these beings, alien entities, typically described as short, with large, almond-shaped eyes, and gray skin. The descriptions matched the sensations he had felt during the abduction attempt. The sensation of being watched, the feeling of being pulled against his will. He read about their supposed methods, how they studied their subjects, taking genetic samples, performing invasive experiments, and then erasing memories to leave their victims with nothing but fragments of terror. As he dug deeper, he found more troubling details. There were numerous accounts of people suffering from post-abduction trauma, sleep disturbances, anxiety, and, most disturbingly, vivid dreams of shadowy figures standing just out of reach. He felt his breath catch in his chest as he realized that his experience wasn't just his own. There were others, people he would never meet, who had felt the same fear, the same suffocating presence, the same dark figure. The more he researched, the more the weight of it all pressed down on him. The evidence, the patterns, the stories, it all lined up with his own experience. There was a cold, unsettling truth emerging from the chaos of his thoughts. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was happening to people all over the world, and there was no way to stop it, no way to escape. He sat back, his eyes wide with the realization that he had uncovered something far darker than he could have ever imagined. Whatever was happening to him, it was bigger than just him. The fear settled deep into his bones, and for the first time, he understood the full extent of the nightmare he was living. The night felt eerily quiet, the air thick with tension, as though the world was holding its breath. Another strange light had appeared in the sky, far brighter than the usual stars, pulsing in and out as though beckoning him. He stood in his yard once again, staring up at the glowing orb, an unsettling sense of familiarity creeping into his bones. He felt the tug of the light, as if it was calling him, urging him to step closer. But this time, something was different. He blinked, once, twice, and when his eyes opened again, the light was gone. But in its place was an empty, heavy silence. He stood there for a moment, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He glanced at his watch, but when he saw the time, his heart skipped a beat. What had been a few seconds of staring at the light felt like an eternity. His watch showed that hours had passed, and yet he could barely recall any of them. He looked around, the world seeming unchanged, but the sense of unease grew sharper. He tried to grasp what had happened during those lost hours, but his mind was clouded, like a thick fog was clouding his memory. The sky was darker now, the familiar sounds of nightfall muted, as though everything around him had suddenly shifted, like a pause had been hit on the world, and he had unknowingly missed the unspoken cue to resume. He stumbled inside, his body shaking, but the house felt unfamiliar in a way he couldn't explain. The walls seemed distant, as if they were slightly out of focus. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background, but the sound felt distant. He reached for his phone, and again, time had been warped. His last message was from earlier in the day, the timestamp showing it had been sent an hour ago, but in reality, he had no recollection of having sent it. Frustration bubbled up in his chest. He tried to piece together the fragments of his thoughts, the flashing light, the disorienting lapse in time, but it was all a blur. His memory was a patchwork quilt of images and sensations that didn't make sense. Faces that were unfamiliar yet strangely familiar. Places that should have been comforting but felt wrong. A looming, shadowy figure standing just outside the reach of his vision, always just out of focus, but always there. The terror began to build again, tightening around his chest, leaving him breathless. What had happened during those lost hours? Why couldn't he remember? And what was the meaning behind this sudden disappearance of time? He had always believed that he could trust his senses. But now, it felt as if his reality was slipping through his fingers, as if the very fabric of his existence was being warped and twisted. Beyond his control, he sank to the floor, heart pounding, overwhelmed by the growing sense that something far more terrifying than he could comprehend was unfolding. It was late in the evening when the knock came, soft at first, almost hesitant. But when the protagonist opened the door, he was greeted by an unexpected sight. Standing in the dim light of the porch was a figure, cloaked in shadows. A tall, thin man whose face seemed familiar, but not in a comforting way. His features were sharp, angular, and he wore an expression that suggested he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The man didn't speak immediately. His eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto the protagonist with a piercing intensity. It was as if he could see straight through him, into his very soul, the weight of his gaze both unsettling and unnerving. The protagonist's heart raced as the silence between them grew thick, suffocating. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and calm, but with an edge of urgency that sent a shiver down the protagonist's spine. "You don't know me," the figure said, his words deliberate. "But I know everything about you. About what you've been seeing in the sky, about the lights, the figures, the missing time. I know what you're going through." The protagonist felt a chill grip his chest, his throat tightening. How could this man know? Who was he? "You're not the first," the man continued, his voice now laced with a hint of warning. "And you won't be the last. This thing, whatever it is, it's coming for you. Coming for all of us." He paused, taking a breath, as if weighing how much to say. "The event that's coming, it's bigger than you think. The truth, the one you've been trying to understand, it's about to surface. And when it does, everything will change." The words hung in the air, thick with foreboding. The protagonist's mind raced, but he couldn't form a coherent thought. Who was this man, and how did he know so much? "You're being watched," the man said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've been marked. They're not just watching anymore, they're preparing for something. And you need to be ready." The coldness in the man's voice was enough to make the protagonist step back, his instincts screaming for him to slam the door shut and end the encounter. But something held him there, something he couldn't explain, a pull deep inside him. He had to know more. "Who are you?" the protagonist asked, his voice shaky, his mind racing with the flood of information. The figure's lips curled into a slight, knowing smile. "It doesn't matter who I am," he replied. "What matters is that you're running out of time. You need to prepare. They're closer than you think." Without another word, the man turned and began walking away, fading into the darkness of the night as if he had never been there at all. The protagonist stood frozen in place, the weight of the man's words echoing in his mind. The sense of dread intensified, and the reality of the situation began to settle in. He was no longer just a witness. He was part of something much larger, something he didn't fully understand, and it was only just beginning. The letter arrived on an ordinary afternoon, tucked neatly into his mailbox, almost as though it had been placed there without a trace. The envelope was thick, made of a rough, almost ancient-looking parchment. There was no return address, no sign of where it came from. What stood out, however, was the symbol stamped in deep black ink across the front, a circular shape intertwined with sharp lines, an emblem that was both foreign and familiar in some unsettling way. His pulse quickened as he held it in his hands, turning it over, unsure whether to open it or to throw it away. But the temptation to understand what was happening to him, to grasp at any shred of truth, was too powerful to resist. With trembling fingers, he tore open the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the texture smooth, almost too smooth for something so old-looking. The words on the paper were simple, typed in a clean, almost mechanical font, stark against the otherwise aged paper. "You are invited to meet, tomorrow night, 9 p.m., by the old oak tree, the place where the sky meets the earth. Come alone, come prepared." The letter didn't say who had written it, nor did it offer any explanation of what prepared meant. But the chilling words sent a wave of uncertainty through his body. He could feel his breath quicken, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Was this the answer he had been searching for? Or was it a trap, another part of the strange phenomena that had been haunting him? The old oak tree, it was an abandoned clearing on the outskirts of town, a place few people dared to visit. The mention of the sky meeting the earth sent an eerie shiver through his spine. Had this been the place where he had witnessed strange lights before? Or was he simply grasping for meaning in the chaos of his mind? Despite the fear gripping him, there was something else, an undeniable pull, a desire to know, to understand why all of this was happening to him. The invitation, though cryptic and unsettling, was a sign. It was a call to something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. That night, as the clock ticked closer to 9 p.m., his mind raced. He paced around his living room, unsure of how to prepare for such an event, for something so unknown. But in the end, he knew he had no choice but to go. He couldn't live with the unanswered questions anymore. The uncertainty was suffocating. With a final glance at the letter in his hand, he stepped out into the cold night air. The trees outside whispered in the wind, the world quiet except for the beating of his own heart. As he walked toward the clearing, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, returned. Tonight, he would meet whatever had been watching him, and whether it was a step toward salvation or destruction, he couldn't turn back now. The night was cold and still as he made his way through the familiar darkened streets. But something felt different this time. The air seemed thicker, as if it were pressing against him, guiding him forward with a force he couldn't understand. Each step felt deliberate, but not by his own making. His mind buzzed with confusion, questioning his decision to follow the letter. The more he thought about it, the more disconnected he felt from reality. It was as though he wasn't walking on his own, but was being led by something far beyond his control. He tried to focus on his surroundings, looking for landmarks he knew, but they seemed distant, warped. The streetlights flickered above him, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out like fingers. The path ahead seemed endless, and yet, somehow, it was familiar. He had walked this same route countless times, yet tonight, it was as though he had never seen it before. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How had he gotten here? Was he sleepwalking? Was he dreaming? The question gnawed at him, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't piece it together. The further he walked, the more the sense of déjà vu crept in. The place, the quiet, empty roads, the trees that loomed like silent sentinels. It felt like he had been here before, but there was no place like this in his memory. He hadn't walked this far in years, yet somehow, this path, this moment, felt as though it was waiting for him. He glanced down at the letter once more, the paper now folded in his hand. Its weight, a constant reminder of the invitation. The symbol on it had burned itself into his mind. The more he stared at it, the more it felt like something he should have recognized, a part of his life, perhaps even his past. But that was impossible, wasn't it? He had no memory of ever seeing it before, and yet, the pull of it was undeniable. Before he could ponder further, he stepped into the clearing, the old oak tree looming ahead. The shape of it, gnarled and twisted by years of weathering, looked more like a silhouette against the starless sky. But something was wrong. The air was too still, the silence too complete. It felt like the world was holding its breath. He moved closer to the tree, but as he did, his feet seemed to move faster, almost as though they were moving on their own. The ground beneath him shifted slightly, and he suddenly found himself standing in the exact spot where the letter had instructed him to go. He hadn't realized it, but somehow he had arrived. The clearing, the tree, everything was exactly as it should have been, and yet it wasn't. The more he looked around, the more the sense of unease washed over him. The place felt too familiar, as if it had been waiting for him, as if it had always been his destination. He stood frozen, the letter now clenched in his hand, as though waiting for something or someone to speak. The silence around him was deafening, thick with anticipation. And then, just as he was about to turn back, the air shifted and a shadow fell over him. He stood there, in the clearing, heart racing, as the shadow loomed closer. He was not alone. One by one, figures emerged from the darkness, slowly stepping into the dim light cast by the overhead moon. They moved with an unsettling calmness, their eyes locked on him, as if they had been waiting for him all along. The first figure spoke, its voice a low, almost whispering tone. "You're not the only one." The words seemed to echo in the stillness of the night, sending a chill down his spine. As the others gathered around, each of them exchanged wary glances. They looked as if they had seen something, experienced something that none of them could escape. Their faces were tired, haunted, yet there was an undeniable connection between them. They all shared the same truth, the same unsettling realization that had begun to claw at the protagonist's mind since the night the light first appeared in the sky. One of them, a man with dark circles under his eyes, stepped forward, his voice shaking as he spoke. "They've been coming for years. We're not the first, and we won't be the last." The protagonist stood frozen, his mind racing to piece together the fragments of his own experiences. The strange marks, the missing time, the feeling of being watched, it all began to converge in his mind like an unsolvable puzzle. They weren't just sightings or random occurrences. The UFOs, the lights, the beings they were connected, manipulating, experimenting with them all. Each of them had been touched, altered in some way, and each carried a piece of the same horrifying truth. Another voice broke through the tension. A woman, her voice trembling, spoke quietly. "They know us. They know everything about us. They've been watching, following us, for as long as we can remember. But it's not just observation, it's control. We were chosen for a reason. The protagonist felt a sinking sensation in his stomach as the truth began to form in his mind, clear and undeniable. The UFOs were not visitors. They were not explorers, not benevolent beings looking for knowledge. They had been manipulating people, selecting them, shaping their lives and experiences to fit some unknown purpose. The terrifying realization that the encounters weren't just random or isolated events, but part of a larger, more insidious plan, made his legs feel weak. A man in the back of the group, his voice low and hoarse, added, "It's been going on for decades. They've been altering our lives, creating patterns, guiding us without us ever knowing. They've seen us as experiments, as subjects, and we've been powerless to stop them." The words lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. The protagonist could feel the weight of the others' stories pressing in on him, their shared experiences now intertwined with his own. He realized that everything, the strange lights, the disappearances, the feeling of being watched, had been part of something far larger than he could have ever imagined. They were not alone, and they never had been. The darkness of the house felt different now, suffocating, as if it were holding its breath. The silence, once comforting, had taken on a sinister edge, and the shadows seemed to grow longer with every passing moment. At first it was subtle, just a flicker out of the corner of his eye, a slight shift in the darkness. But soon, the shadows began to move on their own, stretching and shrinking as if alive. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But as the days wore on, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. The shadows grew more distinct, more defined, as if they were no longer content to remain in the corners of the room. They crept along the walls, twisting and slithering like dark, formless creatures. His breath caught in his throat every time he turned a corner, half expecting something to reach out from the darkness and grab him. The whispers began shortly after, soft at first, like the faint murmur of wind passing through cracks in the walls. He brushed it off as the house settling, but the whispers grew louder with each passing night, like voices calling his name from far away. They were indistinct, impossible to understand, yet their presence was undeniable. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the whispers still echoing in his mind. They didn't come from outside. They came from within, from the very walls of the house. It was as though they were planted there, deliberately, to drive him mad. At first, he tried to ignore them. He buried himself in work, kept busy, tried to push the creeping dread to the back of his mind. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They followed him, invaded his thoughts, slipping between his waking hours and his dreams. There was no escape. One evening, while sitting alone in his living room, the shadows grew more intense. They pooled in the corners, gathering like a storm ready to break. The air grew thick, stifling, and for the first time, he felt the weight of something ancient pressing down on him. His pulse quickened, his body frozen in place as the room seemed to close in around him. The whispers grew louder, clearer, as if the walls themselves were breathing, exhaling the voices of things far older than anything he could understand. And then, as if to confirm his deepest fears, he felt it. Something inside him stirred a dark presence, something planted within his very being. A cold shiver ran down his spine as the realization hit him. The UFOs hadn't just been watching. They had done something to him. Something deep, something hidden in the recesses of his mind. They had planted something, an idea, an essence, inside him. The whispers weren't just voices. They were thoughts, memories, his memories being altered, twisted. He wasn't sure what was real anymore, or what was being manipulated. Was he still himself? The town was quiet, too quiet. As he drove through the narrow streets, the eerie stillness hung in the air like a thick fog. There were no children playing, no chatter from the local shops, no cars parked along the curb. It was as if the life had been drained from the place. The protagonist had heard whispers about people going missing here, disappearing without a trace. But seeing it firsthand was something entirely different. He parked his car near the town square and got out, the sound of his footsteps the only noise breaking the silence. There was something unsettling about the emptiness, the way the buildings seemed to loom over him, their windows like dark eyes watching his every move. He approached the local diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the dim light, but as he stepped closer, he noticed that the door was ajar. A breeze blew through the cracks, but there was no one inside. Inside, the tables were still set, mugs and plates scattered across the counter as though the patrons had simply walked out mid-meal. His heart pounded in his chest, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. This wasn't just an abandoned town, it was as if time had stopped here, leaving nothing but remnants of lives interrupted. He made his way further into the town, peering into empty shops, hoping for some explanation, some clue as to where everyone had gone. But as he continued down the winding streets, the realization hit him. The town wasn't just empty. It was missing. There were no signs of struggle, no police tape or investigation. The houses stood like shells, abandoned but untouched. It was as if the people had never existed, their memories wiped clean. He turned a corner and saw a sign for the town's library. The door creaked as he pushed it open, stepping into the dim, dusty interior. Shelves lined the walls, books gathering dust in the silence. But something felt off the air was thick with the weight of memories, of lives lost without a trace. As he walked deeper into the library, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat. A figure, blurry and faint, stood at the far end of the library, just at the edge of his vision. Before he could react, it vanished, like smoke carried by the wind. He felt his legs go weak, his mind racing as the enormity of the situation sank in. The same strange phenomena that had haunted him, shadows, whispers, and disappearing figures, were happening here too. He was no longer just a witness. He was part of a web of terror, trapped in a world where nothing was as it seemed. He rushed back to his car, but as he turned to leave, he realized that the town wasn't just gone, it was forgotten. The streets seemed to twist and warp in his rearview mirror, like the town itself was slipping from his memory, disappearing into the dark corners of his mind. And as the lights of the town faded into the distance, he understood. There was no escape from this place. Not for him. Not for anyone. The shadows had claimed them all. And now, they were coming for him too. The night was thick with the weight of unsolved mysteries, and the protagonist felt a sense of dread he couldn't shake. As he made his way to the researcher's office, an unmarked building tucked away on a quiet street, his thoughts swirled like a storm. What was happening to him? What had he become entangled in? He needed answers, needed to understand how deep this went, how far the UFO's influence reached. He wasn't alone in his confusion, not anymore. The researcher's office was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a desk lamp. Papers, books, and strange equipment cluttered the space. A man in his late 40s, sharp-eyed and weary, sat behind the desk. His name was Dr. Evan Calder, a man whose obsession with UFOs had led him to study the phenomenon for years. He had a reputation in obscure circles for piecing together the fragmented clues left behind by those who had encountered the unknown. Dr. Calder didn't greet him with warmth, but rather a quiet understanding that only deepened the sense of urgency in the room. He gestured for the protagonist to sit, his gaze already fixed on a set of files spread across the desk. Without wasting time on pleasantries, Calder spoke in a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "We've been tracking this for years, you know," he began, his voice tight with unease. "The patterns, the disappearances, the encounters. It's all connected. And it's not random. It's deliberate. The protagonist leaned in, his heart pounding. Calder flipped open a file, revealing a collection of photographs, handwritten notes, and diagrams. Those who encounter the UFOs, he continued, are marked. It's subtle, but unmistakable. It can be anything: strange symbols, markings that appear on their bodies, or, in some cases, even on their possessions. And when the mark appears, something significant follows. Something inevitable. The words sank deep into the protagonist's chest like cold stones. He had a mark, too, a faint, glowing symbol on his arm that had appeared after the attempted abduction. He had thought it was just a strange occurrence, a symptom of his own madness. But now, in the dim light of Calder's office, it felt like a harbinger of something far worse. Calder's eyes darkened as he looked at the protagonist. "These marks," he said softly, "signal the onset of an event, a personal crisis, an overwhelming encounter, or something even worse. Those marked are drawn into the UFO's web. But it's not just about the encounters. They're monitoring us, guiding us toward something. And whatever it is, it's coming." A shiver ran down the protagonist's spine as the pieces began to fall into place. His mind raced, connecting the dots he had never wanted to acknowledge. The UFOs weren't random. They weren't just visitors. They were manipulating events, marking people for reasons beyond his understanding. "Do you have any idea what it is they want?" he asked, his voice strained. Calder shook his head, the shadow of fear clouding his expression. "No, but I believe it's something much bigger than we can imagine. We've all been part of this puzzle, and I think it's about to be solved, and we won't like what we find." The room seemed to grow colder as the weight of their words hung in the air. The protagonist now understood. He was no longer just a witness to these events. He was part of something far more dangerous, a piece of an unsolvable puzzle that had no end in sight. The nights had grown longer, and so had the silence in his home. The strange phenomena, which had once been sporadic and fleeting, now seemed to surround him constantly. The protagonist found himself waking in the middle of the night, his body frozen in place, his mind trapped in the grip of something he couldn't understand. It wasn't just the UFOs anymore. There was something else. Something that lingered in the shadows, watching him. At first, it was only fleeting glimpses, a figure at the edge of his vision, a shape that never fully materialized. Tall, humanoid, yet somehow not entirely human. The figure would vanish the moment he tried to focus on it, leaving behind only the unease that lingered long after. But then, the sightings became more frequent, more distinct. These figures were not just shadows, they were presence, unmistakable and chilling. He would see them standing in the corners of his room, watching him with glowing, empty eyes. There was no sound, no movement, just a constant, oppressive weight in the air, as if the room itself was holding its breath. He never dared to approach them. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to escape. But there was nowhere to run. And then, they began to speak to him not with words, but with thoughts. Their voices invaded his mind, low whispers that echoed in his consciousness. The first time it happened, he thought he was losing his grip on reality. The voice was deep, alien, and yet somehow familiar, as if it had always been there, waiting to be heard. "You are marked," the voice said. "The time is near." His heart raced as he tried to make sense of the message, but there was nothing to grasp, nothing concrete, just a sense of inevitability that settled over him like a fog. Each message was more cryptic than the last, a puzzle he couldn't solve, yet he could not escape the feeling that he was being guided toward something terrible and unknown. Days passed, but the figures were always there, lurking just out of sight. They never approached him directly, but their presence was undeniable, felt in every corner of his home. The telepathic messages grew more frequent, more insistent. "We are the Watchers," they whispered. "You are part of the plan." The protagonist's mind teetered on the edge of understanding, but every time he tried to grasp at the meaning of their words, it slipped further away. He began to question whether they were real at all, or if it was simply his own fractured mind playing tricks on him. Yet the feeling of their presence, the oppressive weight of their silence, remained unshakable. One night, as he sat alone in the darkness, the voice spoke again, its tone sharp and commanding. "You will see soon. We are coming for you." The room felt colder, the air heavier. The fear that had once been distant now wrapped around him, tightening with every passing second. It was no longer just about the UFOs. It was about these unseen entities, their cryptic messages, their constant watch. And now, he understood, they weren't merely observers, they were orchestrators, pulling the strings of his fate. And there was no escaping the path they had set for him. The line between reality and nightmare blurred as the protagonist's world continued to unravel. The encounters, the whispers, the figures that stalked him. None of it made sense, and yet it all felt undeniably real. But it was something deeper, something more invasive that he began to sense in the days that followed. The strange occurrences, the unexplainable events, now seemed to carry a weight he had not fully understood until now. The UFOs, the entities, they were not just observers, they were manipulators. It started with fragments, flashes of memories that weren't his. They would come without warning, violent and intrusive, like a film reel playing in his mind. At first, he dismissed them, chalking them up to stress or sleep deprivation. But as the memories grew more vivid, more detailed, the feeling of wrongness intensified. These were not just random recollections, they were experiences, complete with emotions, sensations, moments of intense fear and confusion. And they were his memories, or at least they felt like they should be. In one instance, he saw himself sitting in a cold, sterile room. His hands trembled as he looked around, seeing nothing but white walls and a single figure standing in the corner. The figure was obscured by shadows, but the feeling of its presence was undeniable. He felt his body stiffen, as if locked in place by some unseen force. The more he tried to focus on the figure, the more it slipped away, leaving only an overwhelming sense of dread. The next memory was of a field, the same strange light from before hovering in the distance. He wasn't alone. There were others with him, people he didn't recognize, but their faces seemed hauntingly familiar. They all stood frozen, their eyes wide, as if caught in a trance. The light grew brighter, drawing them in, and he felt an intense pull toward it, his body moving against his will. The memories, though disconnected, began to form a disturbing pattern. Each flash, each moment, seemed like a piece of a puzzle he couldn't solve. His mind was being invaded, manipulated. It wasn't just a random collection of strange thoughts, they were planting these images in his mind. And then it hit him. This wasn't just some alien visitation. This was an experiment. His mind, his very consciousness, was being tampered with. The UFOs, the entities, they weren't just watching, they were probing, testing, reshaping his thoughts, his memories, his sense of self. He couldn't trust anything anymore. Was he even sure these memories were truly his? Or had they been implanted by whatever force controlled the UFOs? As the days passed, the flashes became more frequent, more intense. His own memories began to warp. He couldn't tell what was real, what was fabricated. The more he fought it, the more the images grew, multiplying until they consumed him entirely. He was no longer sure of anything. Only one thing remained clear. They were in control now, pulling the strings of his mind, and there was no escaping them. The weight of the truth crashed down on the protagonist like a tidal wave, pulling him beneath its crushing force. He had long suspected there was more to the UFOs and their strange manipulations. But now, in the silence of his mind, the full extent of the terror became clear. The memories, the fragments of reality, all began to fit together, each piece locking into place with horrifying precision. He had been oblivious, but now, with the truth shining through the fog, it was undeniable. Humanity was part of something much darker, something beyond the scope of understanding. The entities, the creatures he had feared and struggled to understand, were not just visitors from another world. They were orchestrators of a far grander scheme. Their presence on Earth had never been a coincidence. It had been planned, calculated, and hidden from the world for centuries. The UFOs, the strange occurrences, the inexplicable memories, it was all leading to one horrifying conclusion. The entities were preparing humanity, grooming it for an event that would shatter everything the world knew. In the depths of his mind, the images that had plagued him began to clarify. The field, the cold, sterile rooms, the shadows that never fully revealed themselves. He now saw them for what they truly were. Experiments, not just on him, but on all of humanity. The memories were not his own. They were carefully placed, a psychological imprint left behind to ensure the entity's plans would unfold as they wished. Each encounter, each terrifying experience, was part of a larger agenda, an agenda that spanned centuries, perhaps millennia. The realization was suffocating. The truth had been hidden from humanity for so long, wrapped in layers of secrecy and manipulation. The entities were not just observing. They were shaping Earth's future, slowly erasing humanity's free will and replacing it with their own. They were preparing for a cosmic event, one that would alter the very fabric of existence. And humanity, caught in the middle, had been unknowingly groomed to play its part in whatever this event was. The protagonist could feel the ground beneath him shift, the world he once knew now slipping away like sand through his fingers. He had been a mere pawn in their game, and he was not alone. All the strange disappearances, the flashes of memories, the whispers in the dark, these were not isolated incidents. The entities were everywhere, their influence spreading across the globe, manipulating people, steering them toward their inevitable goal. But the worst part of it all was the chilling certainty that the truth he had uncovered was just the beginning. He was no longer sure of what humanity had become or what it was about to face. The event the entities had been preparing for was close, and when it arrived, there would be no escaping its consequences. The terrifying truth was this: the entities were not just visitors, they were architects of humanity's fate, and that fate was now sealed. The protagonist's mind raced with a single, desperate thought: an escape. The truth had become a suffocating weight, one he could no longer ignore. He had to break free from the invisible grip of the entities, the force that had been manipulating him, controlling his every move. But the more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. How could he escape when the very people who had once seemed like allies, those who had shared their stories and fears, were likely under the same control, their every action influenced by the unseen force? He started to plan. It was the only thing he could do. Quietly, in the shadows of his own home, he gathered what he thought might help him break the chains of influence. He packed a small bag with supplies, anything he could think of that might give him a chance, if only for a fleeting moment, to get away from this nightmare. He was prepared to flee to any isolated place, somewhere far from the prying eyes of the UFOs, where he could start fresh, rebuild his life, and perhaps even fight back. But as he moved quietly through the house, every thought seemed to echo back at him. He could sense them somewhere, just out of his reach. The entities were aware, always aware. It wasn't just that they had been monitoring him. It felt as if they had been listening to his every thought, as if his mind wasn't even his own anymore. He could almost hear their whispers, a faint hum in the back of his consciousness. His every move, his every idea, felt like it was being fed back to them. He froze, realizing something chilling. The plan he had been so carefully crafting was not a secret. The entities knew what he was doing before he even did it. They had been inside his mind all along, guiding his thoughts, pushing him toward his decisions as if they were setting a course for him to follow. It was all part of their design, their control. The more he tried to break free, the tighter their grip became. As panic began to rise within him, he noticed something else, something even more unsettling. The feeling of being watched had never been more intense. It wasn't just paranoia. The air around him seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't escape. He was being tracked, monitored, not just through the physical world but through his mind. Every thought, every attempt at rebellion, was being seen, analyzed, and countered. His attempts to fight back were futile. They had already anticipated this. He felt the cold realization settle in, more final than any fear he had ever experienced. He was trapped. There was no escape. No matter how far he ran, how deep he hid, the entities would always find him. They had already won. The days blurred together as the protagonist's attempts to flee grew more futile. Every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into the web of control he had been desperately trying to escape. At first, he believed there was a chance, just a sliver of hope, that if he could outsmart them, outrun them, he might regain his freedom. But the more he tried to resist, the more he realized that the line between his own thoughts and the influence of the entities had become dangerously thin. It wasn't just the overwhelming sense of being watched anymore. It was the feeling that his very thoughts were no longer his own. The entities had begun to occupy the spaces in his mind, their whispers becoming the soundtrack to his every waking moment. His thoughts no longer felt solid, stable. They were fragmented, slipping away like sand through his fingers. He would try to grasp an idea, a plan, only to feel it fade before he could fully understand it. It was as if the thoughts were no longer his to command. He started to question the very essence of his identity. Was he still the person he had been before the UFOs arrived, before the abductions and the strange markings and the constant fear, or had the entities already taken that part of him? He felt the slow unraveling of his sense of self, like the fabric of his mind was being worn away by an unseen hand. The struggle to hold on to who he was became more desperate, more painful, as the control of the entities seeped deeper into his consciousness. Sometimes, he would catch himself in moments of disorientation, unable to distinguish his own thoughts from the subtle influence of the UFOs. He would try to recall his memories, but they felt fractured, out of focus. The people he had once known, the life he had once lived, seemed like distant echoes, fading further each day. What if the person he used to be had already been erased, replaced by whatever the entities wanted him to be? There were moments when his own voice felt foreign to him. He would speak, but the words felt like they were coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper within him, a voice he didn't recognize. The more he struggled, the more the distinction between his mind and the entity's influence vanished. It was a battle he couldn't win. Each time he thought he was regaining control, he would find himself back where he started, lost, confused, and slowly losing the very concept of who he was. The fear of losing himself entirely became unbearable. His mind had become a battleground, and he was no longer sure who the enemy was. Was it the UFOs? Or was it the fading remnants of himself that he was desperately trying to preserve? The air in the room grew thick with tension as the presence of the entities became undeniable. For weeks, they had been there, hovering on the edge of his awareness, manipulating his thoughts, blurring the line between reality and their control. But now, something was different. Now, they were making themselves known. He could feel their presence, as if they were inside his very mind, their voices swirling in his head like a distant hum. And then, Without warning, they spoke. Not aloud, but inside his thoughts. Their words, a silent intrusion that echoed through his consciousness. "We are not here to harm," they said. The voice was calm, devoid of malice, but it sent a shiver down his spine nonetheless. "We are here to prepare." Prepare? For what? The question rose in his mind like a desperate cry for understanding. He tried to push against the sensation of their words, to ignore the pull of their presence. But it was impossible. Their influence had already woven itself too deeply into his thoughts, too deeply into his being. As if sensing his hesitation, they continued. "Humanity stands on the precipice of a great cosmic event. We are here to guide, to ensure your survival, and to offer you the knowledge you will need to endure what is to come." The words hit him like a physical blow, each one more disorienting than the last. He had spent so much time fighting them, trying to break free, trying to understand why they were here. But now, they were offering something he hadn't expected. An explanation. A reason. The flood of thoughts left him reeling. His mind raced with questions, each one tumbling over the other, but none of them could find their way out into the world. He was trapped, caught in a web of their influence. "You have been chosen," they said, their voice both soothing and terrifying. "Not all of humanity will understand what is coming, but you will. You will know what to do." For a moment, he felt a flicker of hope, a brief spark of understanding. Could they be telling the truth? Could they really be trying to help? But that flicker was quickly drowned out by fear. How could he trust them? How could he trust the very entities that had twisted his thoughts, made him question his reality, made him lose himself in their endless whispers? The weight of their presence pressed down on him, urging him to listen, to accept their guidance. He could feel the pull of their influence, the desire to surrender, to stop fighting. But something inside him, something human, resisted. The choice was his. Trust them and learn what they had come to offer, or fight back, risk everything, and try to free himself from their grasp. But could he truly escape? Could he ever trust his own mind again? The answer was elusive, slipping away as their voice grew stronger, louder, urging him to accept their purpose. And in that moment, he realized, whatever he chose, there would be no turning back. The world around him felt suffocating, each passing moment drawing him deeper into the grip of the entities. He had tried everything, running, fighting, screaming, but the more he resisted, the stronger their hold became. He could feel their presence now, not just in his mind but in his very bones. A constant pressure that weighed him down. He made every breath a struggle. It was in the dead of night that he finally came to the realization. He could not run any longer. There was no escape, no sanctuary. The walls of his own mind had been closed off to him, and the very space around him felt like a trap. The realization came like a cold hand on his chest, stealing the warmth from his heart. The entities were in control. There was no question anymore. They had shaped him, altered him, twisted his thoughts into something unrecognizable. And yet, even in his broken state, a sliver of defiance remained. The confrontation happened without warning, a flood of darkness sweeping through the room as the entities revealed themselves fully, no longer lurking in the edges of his consciousness. They were there, standing before him, in a form that defied understanding, shifting, ever-changing, yet somehow constant. They were vast, their presence so overwhelming that it felt as if the air itself trembled with their power. "You know you cannot escape." Their voices echoed in unison, filling his mind, wrapping around him like tendrils of smoke. "You have already made your choice." He could barely move, his body frozen by their will. But his mind was still his own, still capable of thought, still capable of defiance. "No," he whispered, the word breaking from his lips like a tremor. I will not be a part of this. The response was immediate, like a wave crashing over him. The room spun, his vision blurring as the entities pushed into his mind, forcing him to confront the impossible choice they had laid before him. You will be, they said simply, or you will perish. His heart raced, the weight of their words settling in his chest like a stone. The choice was beyond comprehension, surrender or die. Both options felt like a kind of death, one of spirit, the other of body. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to find a way to fight back. But every thought, every impulse was drowned out by their presence. They had already stripped him of so much. What was left? In the silence that followed, he felt himself teeter on the edge of collapse. He had never felt so small, so insignificant, so utterly powerless. The walls of his mind, once sturdy, had crumbled, and in their place, only emptiness remained. The entities had broken him, but they weren't finished yet. He could sense it. They were waiting for him to choose, to give in. And as the darkness pressed closer, he wondered if he had already chosen. Long before they had come, the air in the room seemed to pulse with energy as the entities continued to loom, their presence heavy and all-encompassing. The protagonist's mind, already teetering on the edge of collapse, strained to comprehend what was being shown to him. He had thought them to be visitors from beyond the stars, beings of unimaginable power from distant galaxies, but now the truth began to unravel before him. A truth so staggering that it threatened to consume him entirely. We are not from the stars, their voices echoed, a collective hum that vibrated through his very bones. We are from here, from Earth, from before the time, you know. The words cut through him like a blade, the weight of them sinking deep into his heart. The Earth? They had been here all along, not visitors, not invaders, but something far older, something born from the very soil of this planet. They were not alien at all, but an intelligence that had existed long before humanity had even begun to form. An intelligence that had once ruled over the Earth, shaping its course, guiding its evolution, and now, after millennia, had returned to reclaim what was once theirs. He staggered back, his head spinning, struggling to hold on to the fragile thread of his own identity. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they were too much, too overwhelming. He thought of the strange symbols, the inexplicable events, the whispers in the dark. He thought of the abductions, the experiments, the marks on his skin. Everything that had happened was part of a larger story, a story that reached back to a time before recorded history. You are the inheritors. The entities continued, their voices colder now, filled with ancient, unyielding authority. We have watched as you have shaped this world, as you have built your civilizations and dreams, but it is time to return what was once ours. It is time for the Earth to be restored. The truth slammed into him like a tidal wave, each word carrying the weight of centuries. They weren't here to explore, to learn, or to study. They were here to take back what had been lost, to reclaim a planet they had once called home. The human race had never truly been in control. They had been allowed to rise, allowed to build, but now the time had come for them to relinquish their hold. He could feel it now, their power, their history, their ancient will. It was in the air, in the very fabric of reality itself. They were not merely observing, they were planning, preparing. Their return was no accident. It was an inevitability. A sickening realization settled deep within him. Everything he had known, everything he had believed in, was a lie. The UFOs, the abductions, the manipulation, these were not acts of an alien race trying to understand humanity. No, they were the movements of a people who had once ruled the Earth, and now they had come to reclaim it. The question that had haunted him for so long, the question of their purpose, was now clear. They were not here to help, to guide, or to protect. They were here to dominate once more. The weight of the truth was suffocating, but it only fueled the protagonist's desperation to break free. He couldn't just accept it. He couldn't allow these ancient beings to reclaim the earth, to rewrite history and erase humanity's chance to carve out its own future. The thought of them, their cold, calculating minds, controlling everything, was unbearable. In a moment of clarity, he reached for the remnants of his willpower and charged forward. There had to be a way to fight back, to wrest control from their grasp. His body moved on instinct, driven by the instinctive need to protect, to preserve what little freedom remained. But every step was met with resistance. The air around him thickened, constricting, like invisible hands pulling him back, restraining him with an invisible force. He clenched his fists, gritted his teeth. He could feel them, their presence, every part of his mind under their control. His thoughts, his actions, all manipulated before they even had a chance to take shape. The harder he fought, the more the world around him blurred and twisted. He reached for a chair to throw, but before he could even lift it, the weight seemed to double. The air so dense it felt like 1,000 invisible chains were keeping him in place. He staggered backward, breath caught in his throat, choking on the oppressive pressure. The voice came again, soft, cold, and merciless. Struggling is futile. You cannot win. We are older, wiser, beyond your comprehension. The words sent a chill through him, but he couldn't stop. His body moved without his command, his hands trembling, but determined. They had no right to do this, to steal everything, to manipulate his very essence. He had to resist. But the more he fought, the clearer it became this wasn't a battle of strength. It wasn't about breaking free of chains or escaping a physical prison. It was a war of the mind, one where they were always a step ahead. Every attempt at rebellion was countered before it even fully formed. They were always watching, always controlling, always manipulating. Frustration surged through him. He threw himself into another desperate attempt to break free, to scream, to tear down the walls of his own consciousness. But the walls weren't just around him. They were within him. He wasn't just fighting them. He was fighting the very fabric of his own mind, the very thoughts they had implanted, the sense of helplessness they had nurtured. It felt like an endless loop. Every time he found a way to resist, they crushed it. Every thought of rebellion was strangled before it could even take root. The fight, he realized, was not just physical, it was mental. It was a battle of wills, and in that moment, he wasn't sure if he could win against an intelligence so far beyond his own understanding. He staggered, falling to his knees. His breath was shallow, ragged. Was this the end? Would humanity simply be absorbed into the cold, calculating machine of these ancient beings? Would they erase everything that made him human, everything that made the world what it was? There had to be a way. He couldn't give up, not yet. But the question lingered, growing darker in his mind. Was there any hope left? Or was this the beginning of the end? The air was thick with tension as the final confrontation loomed. The UFOs, their presence looming above Earth, cast an unshakable shadow over the planet. Every attempt to stop their plans had failed, and now, the protagonist was faced with his ultimate test. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something more fundamental to the very core of existence. The battle for humanity's future would come down to the nature of consciousness itself. He stood on the edge of despair, the weight of the world pressing down on him, but there was still one last chance. One final attempt to take control. The entities had shown their power, had shown how effortlessly they could manipulate, how completely they could alter reality with just a thought, but somewhere deep within him, a flicker of resistance remained. If consciousness was truly the battlefield, then maybe, just maybe, there was a way to fight back, not with force, but with the mind itself. The skies darkened as the UFOs descended, their forms casting an eerie glow that seemed to bend the very fabric of space. His pulse quickened as he felt them encroach, as if the very air around him was charged with an unspoken command. He could hear the whispers, their voices cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. They were closing in, ready to finish what they had started, but the protagonist refused to let them win. With every fiber of his being, he focused, pushing past the fear that had once crippled him. This was his mind, his consciousness, and he wouldn't let them take it. He fought not just against them, but against the self-doubt they had planted, against the fear of failing. He couldn't let them define him. He had to define himself. Suddenly, he felt the shift. The air around him became heavier, vibrating with a strange energy, and for the first time, he understood what they had been trying to do all along. They weren't just trying to conquer the earth, they were trying to conquer the mind, to alter what it meant to be human. They wanted to control consciousness itself, to rewrite the very fabric of thought. And that, he realized, was where their power lay. But it was also their weakness. Consciousness was not something they could simply control. It was something that could evolve, adapt, fight back. It wasn't an object to be manipulated. It was the essence of life itself, unpredictable, untouchable. It was something beyond their reach, beyond their control. As the UFOs hovered above, their presence pressing in on him, he knew what he had to do. He focused every ounce of his willpower, using the very essence of his consciousness to push back, to reject their influence. He fought with everything he had against their power, against their manipulation, and most importantly, against the fear they had planted inside him. The UFOs trembled in response, their energy wavering, faltering. For the first time, it seemed they were unsure, confused, and as the protagonist pushed further, the world around him began to shift, to change. He wasn't just fighting for his survival anymore. He was fighting for the future of humanity, for the very nature of what it meant to be free. The final showdown wasn't just about stopping an invasion. It was about reclaiming control over the mind, over consciousness itself. The familiar sensation began creeping over him again, the slow, steady erasure of his memories. At first, it was subtle, like a distant fog clouding his thoughts. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. The once vivid moments of his life, the faces, the places, began to blur, slipping from his grasp like sand through his fingers. He had fought so hard, struggled so fiercely, only for this haunting sensation to return, as if everything he had done was being erased, one thought at a time. He tried to focus, tried to anchor himself to the fragments of his past, but it felt like swimming against a current, every effort pulling him deeper into the abyss. Faces he had known, names he had once held dear, all faded like echoes in a long-forgotten dream. The more he resisted, the harder it became to hold on, and the more terrifying the realization grew. It wasn't just his memories that were slipping away. It was his very identity. The UFOs had never just been a threat to Earth. They had invaded his mind in ways he could never have anticipated. They had not only controlled his thoughts, but had begun systematically dismantling who he was. Each moment of clarity, each flicker of resistance, only seemed to trigger another wave of erasure. His thoughts grew disjointed, fragments of himself lost in the void they were creating. Who was he now? What had he become? In his darkest moments, when the panic threatened to overwhelm him, he realized the cruel truth. The UFOs weren't just erasing his memories, they were remaking him. They had stripped away everything that made him human, layer by layer. His past, his experiences, his very selfhood were becoming nothing more than data to be rewritten. But something inside him refused to yield. A small, flickering spark of defiance refused to be extinguished. He wasn't going to let them win. He couldn't, Not when everything he had fought for, his memories, his life, was slipping away. With trembling hands, he clutched at the remnants of his mind, trying desperately to hold on to something solid. And then, in the quiet, fleeting moments of clarity, it came to him. The UFOs were not infallible. They could erase his memories. He had one final chance to fight back, to take control of the only thing they could not touch. It was time to stop being a passive observer in his own story. He had to reclaim his identity, his memories. Even if the battle took every ounce of strength he had left, he would fight to the end. This war wasn't just for the survival of Earth, it was for the survival of himself. He wouldn't let them steal who he was, not without a fight. For the first time in what felt like forever, the fog in his mind began to clear. The oppressive weight that had clouded his thoughts for so long suddenly lifted, and memories, real, undeniable memories, rushed back in a flood. He saw it all. The abduction, the cold, alien presence, the UFOs hovering in the distance, their glowing lights casting a pallor on the night sky. He could feel the hum of their power, the way it invaded his thoughts, bending his will. He had been a pawn in a game far larger than he could have ever imagined. The entities, those cold, calculating figures, were not just invaders, they were architects of something vast, something ancient. Their manipulation was not limited to his mind alone. It stretched back to the very beginning of time, woven into the fabric of humanity itself. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. He had been part of a much grander plan all along, a plan that reached across the stars, spanning eons. His life, his struggle, had always been leading to this moment. The truth settled in his chest, heavy and undeniable. He wasn't just some random target of an alien experiment. No, he was a piece of the puzzle, an integral part of their long-term design. The UFOs, the entities, the erasure of his memories. It was all part of a carefully orchestrated process. They had been preparing him for something. And he had been blind to it all. Until now. In this moment of clarity, he saw his true role in the grand cosmic plan. He was a conduit, a bridge between humanity and the ancient intelligence that had controlled them from the shadows. The UFOs were not just here to observe, they were here to reclaim what was once theirs. And he was the key to unlocking that power. He had been fighting to retain his humanity, to hold on to his identity. But now, it was clear. His humanity wasn't something to preserve, it was something to evolve. The entities had never sought to destroy him. They had sought to transform him, to unlock the potential buried deep within him. They had chosen him for a reason, and now he understood why. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. He was no longer a victim in this war. He was a player, a participant in a game that spanned the cosmos. The power of the ancient intelligence was inside him, waiting to be awakened. It had always been there, dormant, waiting for the right moment to rise. In this moment of awakening, he knew what he had to do. He had been prepared for this. His role was clear. The question was no longer whether he could stop them. It was whether he would embrace the power within himself or fight against it. The choice was his. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a suffocating fog. The air was thick with the knowledge that whatever choice he made now would ripple through time, altering the course of humanity forever. The entities, their cold, unwavering presence just beyond the veil of his perception, waited patiently. They had always been patient, knowing that the time for his decision would come. His mind raced, torn between two paths that seemed both equally impossible and inevitable. On one hand, there was the pull of his humanity, the urge to resist, to maintain control over his thoughts, his memories, and his identity. He had fought so long to hold on to who he was, to retain the scraps of the person he once was. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just about holding on, it was about survival. not just of his body, but of the very essence of who he was. On the other hand, there was the allure of the ancient intelligence. It whispered to him now, its voice laced with promises of power, knowledge, and a future beyond the constraints of human existence. It offered him the chance to transcend, to become something greater, something eternal. All he had to do was surrender, embrace the force that had been guiding him all along, to let go of his fragile, limited humanity and step into a destiny that stretched far beyond Earth. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the voices that echoed in his mind. They were there, pushing him, coaxing him. He could feel their influence, like invisible hands wrapping around his thoughts, pulling him closer to them. It was tempting. The promise of power was seductive, like a whispering wind that carried him toward an unknown horizon. The very idea of shedding the limitations of human life was almost too alluring to ignore. But then, a memory surfaced, a moment from his past, a quiet time before all of this began. He remembered his family, the faces of loved ones, the laughter shared in simpler days. He remembered his humanity not just as a concept, but as the very core of his existence. The fleeting moments of connection, the joy of being alive. Was it worth giving that all up? His chest tightened as the reality of the decision hit him. He could accept the alien intelligence, give in to the transformation, and perhaps become something beyond human. Or he could fight, and with that fight, protect the fragile, beautiful thing that had always been his humanity. The fate of the world, of every person he had ever known, depended on this choice. And yet, it felt so personal, so intimate. It wasn't just about saving the world, it was about saving himself, his soul. The moment had come. He exhaled sharply, knowing that whatever he decided, there would be no going back. The world seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a moment that stretched far beyond time. The cosmic event loomed, an all-encompassing force that promised to change everything. As the days passed, the protagonist felt the weight of his decision growing heavier, like the pressure of an unseen hand pushing against his chest. He could sense the approaching shift, an undeniable force pulling at him, drawing him toward an unknown future. The choice had never been more clear, yet it felt more impossible than ever. To resist meant defying not just the alien intelligence, but the very essence of the future that had been laid before him. It meant holding on to the fragile, fleeting human existence he had fought so hard to protect. But it also meant condemning humanity to remain shackled to its own limitations, trapped in a cycle of fear, war, and strife. Embracing the new reality, on the other hand, he was a step into the unknown, a surrender to something far greater, more ancient, and more powerful than anything he had ever known. It promised transcendence, an escape from the burden of human flaws and mortality. The intelligence offered him the keys to an entirely new existence, one that was limitless and eternal. All he had to do was let go. The choice was not just his own. It was the fate of Earth, the fate of every living being. The intelligence had made it clear the cosmic event was not just a moment of transformation for him, but for the entire planet. Everything that had led to this point, every encounter with the UFOs, every abduction, every whispering voice, had been a part of the grand design. The future of humanity hung in the balance. The protagonist walked through the quiet night, the sky above him, a deep, infinite black, filled with the silent pulse of the approaching event. The stars seemed to flicker with a new intensity, like distant beacons calling him toward a destiny he could not ignore. The alien intelligence had already begun its preparations, its influence now woven into the very fabric of the earth. He could feel it, in the air, in the earth beneath his feet, in the rhythm of his heartbeat. As he stood there, facing the horizon, he realized that his decision was not just a personal one. It was the decision of every human who had ever walked this planet, every soul that had ever dreamed of something greater. The intelligence had made its offer, but it was up to him to choose. To resist meant preserving the imperfect beauty of humanity. To embrace the change meant stepping into a new era, one where the limitations of Earth would no longer hold them back. The stars shimmered, the universe watching, waiting, and with that, he knew he had to choose. The final moment arrived like a silent wave, sweeping across the protagonist's soul with a heaviness that both lifted and crushed him. His choice was made, but the consequences, vast and incomprehensible, had only just begun to ripple through the fabric of existence. The cosmic event unfolded as a quiet roar, not in the blinding flash of light or the cataclysmic upheaval he had expected, but in the stillness that followed the rupture of reality. It was as if the universe had sighed, releasing a long-held breath, and in that exhale, the world was irrevocably changed. Humanity had witnessed glimpses of the unknown before, had shuddered at the mysteries that circled above and around them, but never had they been so close, so intertwined with forces beyond their understanding. The UFOs, once distant and alien, now hovered like shadows at the edge of human consciousness, their presence woven into the air, the soil, the very heartbeat of the earth itself. The intelligence behind them, once an unseen hand, had now woven itself into the fabric of life, forever altering the course of history. The protagonist, standing at the center of this new world, felt the enormity of the transition. What had seemed like a battle for control was now revealed as something far more profound. A passage, a metamorphosis. He could feel it in his veins. A deep hum that resonated within him. The influence of the intelligence pushing and pulling at the edges of his mind. The answers he had sought, the meaning behind every abduction, every whisper, every dream, were now becoming clearer. The universe, once so distant, was now an open book, its pages unfolding slowly, revealing truths too vast for the human mind to fully comprehend. But even as he stood there, witnessing the world's transformation, a part of him knew that this was only the beginning. The questions were far from answered. The UFOs, the intelligence, the events leading up to this moment, everything was part of a larger, still hidden truth. What had seemed like a culmination was merely the opening of a door, one that led into realms of existence and understanding humanity could not yet grasp. Across the planet, people felt the change, though they may not have fully understood it. The sky above seemed deeper, as though the stars were now closer, watching. The moon, once a mysterious object in the night, now pulsed with an energy that felt almost familiar, like a long-lost companion. The earth itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with the unknown intelligence, its rhythm now part of a greater, cosmic dance. The protagonist's journey had ended, but the world around him was only beginning its evolution. The mysteries of the UFOs, once unsolvable, were now inextricably woven into the fabric of existence, waiting to be explored. And as humanity stepped forward into this new reality, they would learn that the true nature of the universe, its infinite complexities, its untold histories, its hidden truths, was not something they had to discover. It had always been here, watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The end, it seemed, was just the beginning.